Hello and welcome to another edition of All Things Dairy. I'm Jim Carper, editor of Dairy Foods. Today we're talking about the labeling of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, on food labels. Should the existence of GMOs, also called genetically engineered organisms, appear on a food label? And how should it appear? Should the federal government determine this, or is it best left up to each individual state? Well, the state of Vermont enacted its own law, the first state to do so. Here to talk about that law and what it means to the dairy foods industry is Emily Lyons, the Director of Regulatory Affairs and Counsel for the International Dairy Foods Association. Welcome to the program, Emily.
Hi, Jim. It's great to be here.
So the state of Vermont soon will require that all food sold in the state be labeled regarding the usage of genetically modified organisms. There are some exceptions for dairy products. First, Emily, tell me what this law says, and then we'll get into dairy specifically.
Yeah, Jim. So while the Vermont law on its face seems very simple, as with all laws, the devil is in the details. There are two major requirements under Vermont's law. The first being if the food product contains a genetically modified organism, or GMO, it would be required to carry this label on it, also known as a GMO declaration. Additionally, the law requires if you have this GMO declaration on your food product, you are not allowed to carry the term natural or any similar words to natural on your product labels.
If animal products are exempt, Emily, why do dairy companies need to be concerned?
Dairy companies need to be concerned about the Vermont law for two reasons. First, the animal exception only applies to wholly derived products. And as we know, dairy products can contain many components, not just milk. Some of these include sugar, which can be derived from sugar beets. And sugar beets are mainly produced through genetic engineering now. They also may contain other ingredients that contain things like corn or soy, which are also GE derived, or mainly GE derived in the country. Even if this food product does not require the GE declaration on the food product, you're still required to keep records that you are complying with the law. So dairy companies are going to need to keep information like their labels and how they determine that their product is exempt from the GE declaration in order to satisfy the law's requirements.
What else should a maker of dairy foods be doing to make sure it complies with the law?
Keeping records is just one aspect of what a dairy company needs to do, and they'll need to figure out some kind of record management system in order to manage these records and give them to the state if they are requested. But the first step for a dairy company to determine how they can and should apply or should comply with this law is that they need to evaluate their supply chains. That really means determine which products they sell into Vermont and or plan to sell into Vermont, and then determine what ingredients are in those products and those ingredients that may contain or be derived from a GE source. It's not as straightforward as just is your product GE or not, and many of the exceptions need to be considered by the company. That's why it's so complex.
Emily, there's also part of the law regarding the use of terms like natural and all natural. Can a dairy company use these words on its labels?
Well, that's going to look at, each company is going to need to evaluate each product label, and the main crux of how Vermont has structured the law and the interpretive regulations is whether or not the product needs to bear that GE declaration. So they've tied this ban to using the word natural and other similar terms to whether or not the product has to have that label on it. And if the product doesn't, in some circumstances, they may be able to do that. However, dairy companies will need to evaluate whether or not they use that term on an individual basis and based on their product themselves, because they still will have to comply with not only the Vermont law, but also FDA's labeling guidance.
The food industry would prefer a national law regarding GMO labeling rather than 50 separate state laws. Why is that?
Well, Jim, that's actually very simple. It's easier to comply with one law instead of a patchwork of 50 state laws. As you know, two other states also have state mandatory labeling laws, that being Maine and Connecticut. While neither of these laws are currently effective, each of those laws vary from the Vermont law. None of them are exactly the same. And even if you compare them to the ballot initiatives that have been brought forth in California, California, Washington, and Oregon, you can see that those are each different laws and very different. So with the way that the food system is established, it's easier to comply with one federal law instead of different laws at every single state.
GMOs have been in the news recently. In November, the FDA approved for sale genetically engineered salmon, and the FDA issued guidelines for voluntarily labeling foods from genetically engineered sources. Emily, what's your comment on these developments?
First of all, FDA's approval of GE salmon was a process that took approximately 20 years. So that was a long process for FDA to evaluate the safety and applicability of their labeling requirements to this specific product. Additionally, the final guidance on all other FDA-regulated products on whether or not they contain GE labeling is welcome, as it's now final for companies to be able to follow. It's also a voluntary program, so it really lays out FDA's current thinking on how a company can either state that their products contain genetically engineered ingredients, or on how they can describe that their products do not contain a genetically engineered ingredient.
And finally, Emily, what resources can IDFA provide to its members?
IDFA is always happy to consult with members on interpreting both FDA's guidance as well as Vermont's law and its interpreting regulations. Because compliance is so important with the Vermont law, we're always happy to answer any questions that members have about navigating both the statutory language of the Vermont law as well as the regulations. Also, as I'm sure you know, that law is being challenged, and we're always happy to update members on the status of that lawsuit.
Well, that's it for this edition of All Things Dairy. Remember to like us on Facebook and Google+, and follow us on Twitter, and stay up to date on all things dairy at dairyfoods.com.